Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 30, Be Silent and Get Out. Okay, so let me just start by saying that I am entirely uncomfortable doing this episode because it is not in the realm of theme that I think we normally commonly talk about in the modern church, but I still think it's something that we got to address, okay? And if you may recall that we've started in this year, a lot of our episodes are going to focus on stories that take place in the gospel and what it means for us to pursue the spiritual life in a way that follows Jesus in those stories. And so I want to read the story from the Gospel of Mark, okay? But let me just preface it for a second by saying that this is a story where Jesus is in confrontation with an unclean spirit. Oh man, what do we do with this kind of stuff? This is the kind of crazy story. It kind of comes to us, hits a smack in between the eyes that this is not from the same world that we live in, or it feels that way because we don't have this kind of apparent spiritual, these sorts of forces that, I mean, nothing like this happens to me commonly, okay? Or definitely not on the surface. And you don't want to be careful about like spiritualizing that too much because there really is something radically different going on here, and who knows what the reasons for that are. But it's important to note that this is like strange and it's unfamiliar. And you can, when you encounter something that is strange and unfamiliar, you can kind of like try to see it, try to hear it and feel it. But another approach that a lot of people take is to try to kind of blend what they see in that story into our story and say, well, what we have is kind of like this. It may not be. I mean, that kind of like is a way of whitewashing the story a little bit. It may be that this is just a different thing that's on the edge of our experience and we don't really understand. So I want to be careful with that at the beginning, okay? This kind of explicit, violent interaction between Jesus and the Spirit is different than what I normally experience. Now, I think there are people in the world that do experience something kind of like this, okay? But it's different than my experience, and I want to kind of start off with that and let that strangeness and that unfamiliarity be real, okay? Now, that being said, I do think that there are still dark forces at work in the world, demonic forces that are at work in the world. I think that's true. I think they act in a much more subtle way than takes place in the story, but I think they're present. And so I think this kind of story, even though it has this strangeness to me, I think there is this place that I can kind of come alongside and I can come to the story, okay? I think that's what I want to say. I don't want to make the story come to me, okay? But I want to go to the story, and I want to see what's happening there. So this is Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28, and the story goes like this. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. It's Jesus, right? They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this, a new teaching with authority?" And he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Yeah, it's a crazy story. Okay, Jesus comes into the synagogue. He's going to teach there, and he does. He begins to teach, and everybody's responding favorably to his teaching. They're impressed by the authority with which he teaches. And then there's this incredible disruption. There's somebody that says has an unclean spirit. Unclean is a real interesting word there. I'm not real sure about that word choice, like where that comes from. But the Spirit is present there in the middle of the gathered people of God there in the synagogue. And I think that's important. I think it comes in that context, partly because Mark, as we are going to see later, is going to have a lot to say about the religious context of his people. And I think at the beginning of the story here, it's a way of like kind of him tipping his hand about what he's going to have to say to the people at the temple later, okay? But I think also it's a way of just making clear that these spirits are at work everywhere. Even in what we might imagine was this sanctified, protected sort of place of the synagogue, which is a religious context, that the Spirit is at work, even there. And it interrupts and it recognizes Jesus, and there's all this interchange that we might think. It's a really interesting story. There's a lot that I'd love to unpack. But to kind of come to what I want to say in this episode of Spiritual Steps, I want to ask, what does it mean to be people who follow in Jesus' spirituality, and for us to kind of interact with a story like this, okay? And I think there's a lot that's at work that we can kind of learn from and grow from. First of all, it is significant that this thing, you can't run from this kind of story. It's a significant part of Jesus' ministry and work. In fact, this is the very first story of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark that is like a story of power. I mean, there's healings that are going to come after this, lots of stuff like that, but this is like the very first kind of miraculous demonstration of Jesus' power in the world. And I think that's really significant. I think it's significant for Mark because Mark sees that what Jesus is doing is that he is at war with the powers of the world. And those powers are going to come in form of, the religious authorities in the temple. They're going to come in the form of, the Roman occupiers, later. But those forms are just expressions of, I think, these dark, evil, satanic, demonic forces that are at work in Jesus' world and I think in ours too. And so when Mark has Jesus come have this confrontation with this spirit, it's not just kind of a fringe story. It's really at the center of the story. Jesus is coming to dismantle the dark powers of the world. And so here is this very direct expression of what is going to be expressed in these other ways later on in the story. Okay, so here we have Jesus really engaging in his mission, which is to fight back against and to destroy the demonic powers of the world, okay? So that said, I want to suggest that maybe a couple of ways that we can kind of join in this story, a couple of different little spiritual steps that we might engage, is first of all to have some meditative time about what the where we see dark powers at work in our world. Now, you got to get past the vision of just like a gremlin, unscrewing the bolts on the plane wing. Sometimes the conversation about the demonic is like this really happenstance kind of stuff. And I don't know, maybe spiritual forces are at work in some stuff like that. But more commonly, I think they're at work in just the way people are persuaded to do and carry out evil in the world. And so I think part of our meditation, if we're going to take this seriously, is to reflect on and think on where we see the influence of evil in our world. And we can see that in large macro ways, like the political schemes of the world and the different kind of clashes between powers on that level. Or we might see it in kind of common thread forces, things like the way scarcity operates in the world and the kind of problems and death that it creates in our world. Or we might see it very closely in our own circle, like where is it that we see people being influenced by evil in our world, okay? And then one way we might respond to that is by meditating on that, asking the Lord to give us good vision and perception of that as much as we can, and then let's ask for the Lord's deliverance for that. Okay, now not in this story, but in other places, you have people that come and they bring people who are, possessed by these spirits to Jesus, and they say, "Please, can you help, dispel this thing?" And I think part of our meditative work might be to reflecting on the places where we see evil powers at work, to then ask God to do what He does in this story, to command those things to be silent, to still their voices, and then secondly to dispel them, to command them to get out. All right, that's what Jesus does in this story. This story is about Jesus' authority even over the dark spirits of the world. And I don't understand the reason that these things still kind of run amok, though they may be checked in different ways now. But one thing that I think we need to weave into our spiritual lives, even if it's something that seems so foreign and just seems like something that first world people just don't do, is I think we have to learn to get more comfortable in asking God to, push back from these things, asking for God's deliverance from those spirits. So we ask, first of all, for recognition, and then we, ask the Lord to give deliverance from that thing. And then the other thing that we have to do is we have to become relentless in joining in God's fight against these evil powers. So as we, ask for God's intervention and as we ask for God's help to discern these things, we need to become counter voices. So those things that we think are the voice of evil in the world, we need to be saying the opposite. Okay, we need to be countering those lies and reacting to those lies as we can in the world. Okay, look, I'm uncomfortable with the stories like this. I really am, but I think they're part of the truth of the world. I think part of the truth of the world that we are maybe scared to accept and understand is that dark spiritual forces are at work and they're powerful. But even given that, the truth that is beyond that truth is that the power of Jesus, the power of God, the King, is more powerful than the dark things that we see at work in the world. So let us pray for God to help us recognize the evil that's at work in the world. Let us pray for God to intervene and deliver us from evil. And let's also be a part of joining God's work in the world to bring about good, justice, and to push against the things that are dark and evil in the world. All right, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments or questions you want to get into the conversation, reach out on Twitter. My username there is @StephenHovatter, and it's the same on Instagram. If this sort of thing is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe in whatever the podcasting app that you use is, and we'll be back soon with a new episode. Until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you, and may God be with you on each step of your journey. Peace.